took 9 years before but I began to play the nightclubs in and around.
Nashville has a long memory, and it does not forgive easily. What Dwight Yoakam's career actually cost him, in money, in relationships, in legal battles, and in years of fighting an industry that wanted nothing to do with him, is a story most people have never heard in full, and what he confirmed about all of it changes how you understand everything he ever recorded. Pikeville, Kentucky sits deep in the Appalachian coal fields, where the mountains press in close and life carries a particular kind of weight, and that's where Dwight Yoakam came into the world on October 23, 1956. His family moved to Columbus, Ohio when he was still young, but the Kentucky roots held firm in ways geography couldn't touch. Country music, the raw, unpolished kind that came straight from working people singing about what they actually knew, got into him early and never left. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was already pulling apart the recordings of Merle Haggard and Buck Owens, hearing something in that Bakersfield sound that felt more honest than anything else on the radio, while other young musicians chased the smoother sounds of the 1970s. Dwight moved in the opposite direction, not out of nostalgia, but out of a conviction he couldn't shake. That country music had drifted away from something real, and he wanted to find it again. That conviction carried him to Nashville in 1976, 20 years old, with a guitar and a sound he believed in completely. What he found there was a machine, efficient and commercial, and entirely uninterested in what he was offering. Music Row ran on songwriters and studio productions, on a version of country calibrated for radio play and mass appeal, and Dwight's raw honky-tonk energy had no place in that system. The executives weren't hostile. They were indifferent, which lands harder because indifference doesn't give you anything to push against. The door closed quietly, and he went back to Ohio, thought it through, and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. If Nashville wouldn't have him, he would build his audience somewhere else and come back without asking permission from anyone. Los Angeles in the late 1970s might seem like an odd landing spot for a man committed to traditional country music, but the punk and alternative rock scene spreading through LA at that time carried something Dwight recognized: a rejection of the polished and corporate, a hunger for music that felt earned rather than manufactured. He played wherever venues would book him, which meant rock clubs and dive bars that weren't built for steel guitars and cowboy hats. 5 sets a night in rooms where fights broke out mid-song, where the crowd hadn't come to hear him and had to be converted one song at a time. And that's when something started happening that no label could have engineered. People came back, brought others with them, grabbed strangers by the arm and said, "You have to hear this." Word spread person to person, built entirely on the music itself. Pete Anderson entered the picture during those years, a guitarist and producer who heard exactly what Dwight was reaching for and knew how to capture it on tape. Together, they recorded what would become Dwight's debut album, released independently in 1984 and re-released by Reprise Records in 1986 as Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc. The record arrived in country music like cold air through an open window. The title track, built around a coiling guitar line and a lyric about a young man swallowed by city life, became an anthem for everyone who had ever felt out of step with the world moving around them. The cover of Johnny Horton's Honky Tonk Man climbed the charts and introduced Dwight to a national audience that didn't know it had been waiting for him, and the album went on to achieve double platinum status while reshaping what country music could be. Nashville, which had shown him the door a decade earlier, was paying very close attention now. What followed was a run of albums that built one of the most consistent catalogs in the genre. This time, released in 1993, still gets cited as one of the finest country records of that decade, defined by emotional precision and musical clarity. Hillbilly Deluxe, Buenas Noches, From a Lonely Room, If There Was a Way. Each record carried the same refusal to soften, the same commitment to the tradition he had staked his career on. He sold out venues across the country, collected Grammy nominations, and did all of it while maintaining the outsider's posture that had defined him from the beginning. Creative partnerships built on intense shared vision carry enormous internal pressure, and the one between Dwight and Pete Anderson eventually buckled under differences that had been accumulating for years, over management decisions, business priorities, and direction. The break came in 2004 when Anderson filed a lawsuit against Yoakam for breach of contract, claiming canceled concert performances had cost him significant money after he had already invested his own resources in preparing for the shows. The case settled out of court, terms kept private, but the collaboration was finished. One of country music's most celebrated creative partnerships ended in a courthouse, and the two men never worked together professionally again. Running parallel to that collapse was something even more damaging financially. South of Heaven, West of Hell, released in 2000, represented a level of creative commitment that very few artists attempt. Dwight wrote it, directed it, co-produced it, scored it, and starred in it, alongside an ensemble cast that included Vince Vaughn, Bridget Fonda, and Billy Bob Thornton. Reviews called it disjointed and overextended. Box office performance was poor, and when major investors pulled out during production, Dwight reportedly finished the film with his own money, taking on significant personal debt to see it through. That financial pressure strained relationships throughout his professional circle and contributed to a period of turbulence that extended well beyond the release date. Sling Blade had come 4 years before that, and the role it gave him was nothing like anything his music career suggested he was capable of. Billy Bob Thornton cast him as Doyle Hargraves, a volatile presence whose cruelty operated through restraint rather than explosion, the controlled unpredictability of someone who genuinely frightened the people around him. Audiences who knew Dwight as a country star in rhinestone jackets watched and understood they had been wrong about the limits of what he could do. David Fincher's Panic Room put him opposite Jodie Foster as the cold and menacing Raoul. Wedding Crashers showed a looser comedic presence. The FX series Wilfred gave him room to be genuinely eccentric. Under the Dome put him in serialized television where steady authority mattered more than flash. Each role called for something different, and he delivered something different each time. His explanation for how he approaches acting comes back to the same place as his explanation for music. Both are exercises in finding something true about a human being and bringing it forward without the protection of irony or distance. Early theater in junior high and high school gave him the foundation, a comfort in front of an audience that the recording studio later refined. He doesn't separate his music career and his acting career in his own thinking, because to him they have always been two expressions of the same drive. The need to tell a story that produces the specific feeling of being seen. Beck entered the story in 2012, co-producing several tracks on the album Three Pears, and the collaboration produced something neither artist could have made alone. During one session, Dwight laid down a scratch performance on electric guitar, and Beck told him to keep it exactly as it was, imperfections included. That moment broke something open. The perfectionism that had driven so much of his output gave way to something more immediate, and tracks like Take Hold of My Hand and Rock It All Away demonstrated that the Bakersfield sound and the indie sensibility were not as far apart as anyone had assumed. A new audience found him through that record and discovered 40 years of work they hadn't known existed. Warner Music Group became the next fight, and the most personal one yet. In 2021, Dwight filed a lawsuit against the label over ownership rights to his early recordings centered on guitars, Cadillacs, etc., and the copyright termination provisions in United States law, which allow artists to reclaim rights after 35 years. His legal team argued that Warner had failed to honor valid termination notices and continued distributing recordings he had legally reclaimed without his consent. Warner disputed the timing and validity of those notices. Both sides reached a private settlement in 2022, terms undisclosed. What the lawsuit made visible was that the same refusal that drove him out of Nashville in 1976 was still operating at full strength. The refusal to let someone else decide what his work was worth or who got to control it. At 68 years old, Dwight Yoakam shows none of the signs of someone settling into legacy act status. His Sirius XM program, Dwight Yoakam and the Bakersfield Beat, runs as both a celebration of the musical tradition that formed him and a platform for artists deserving wider attention. Younger country artists credit him openly as a foundational influence, and streaming has given his catalog wave after wave of new discovery among listeners who weren't alive when guitars, Cadillacs first hit radio. What the full arc of his career demonstrates, from the Nashville rejection in 1976 to the Warner Music lawsuit in 2021, from the Los Angeles dive bars to the set of Sling Blade, from the Pete Anderson partnership to the Beck sessions, is that the qualities that make an artist difficult to manage are usually the same ones that make their work impossible to forget. The refusal to adapt on command, the insistence on a particular kind of truth, the willingness to absorb financial damage in defense of a vision, those are not comfortable qualities in a business partner, and they never were. But they are exactly what separates a body of work that endures from one that fades when the trend that produced it moves on. Nashville tried to tell him he was wrong. Investors walked away from his film. Legal battles drained time and money. And through all of it, the music held, raw, sharp, and achingly precise, rooted in the Kentucky hills and the Los Angeles bar stages, unmistakably his, and more than 40 years later, still playing everywhere someone needs to hear something real.